Today we're going to talk about a few subjects, but I wanted to take you back for just a moment from last week. Last week, we were talking about some African American items that had occurred in this country, but one that you might not know about that's rather important to members of the African community, and it is that in 1936, Adolf Hitler sponsored an Olympic game in Berlin. And the man who won those games there that was important to us is Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens is a black man. And his wonderful moment in the sun came when he won in front of Herr Hitler, who thought it was impossible for people of color to do this. The Berliners remembered it, and after Hitler was long gone, the old stadium that had been built by Herr Hitler was still standing in Berlin. And I used to take my friends there to see something. As you go up to the stadium, you will notice there is a rather large and prominent road that comes into the stadium. And it's known as the Jesse Owens Allee. So the Berliners have remembered a man, a black man, from the 1936 period, and they want you all to know that he was there and he won as a put down to Mr. Hitler. Now, Berlin is full of memories like that, but the Jesse Owens one is one of my favorites, so I wanted to tell you about it. We're not going to spend any time on the German Olympics, but I assume some of you have been watching the ones here. We are going to talk about Taiwan, America's Asian ally. Taiwan, right this moment, is being protected by one of your largest American naval fleets. It's the 6th Fleet. Let me see if I got that right. No, it's the 7th Fleet. The 7th Fleet guards Taiwan. The 6th Fleet guards the southern approaches to NATO. Its headquarters is in Naples. And the only three things I know that are important about Naples are there's a large volcano nearby called Vesuvius. And some of you have gone with me recently to see the ruins below the great volcano. Those ruins, of course, are Pompeii. And the Pompeii exhibit is now in San Francisco. And if you haven't gone to see it yet, you should. It's really quite wonderful what they've done with it and what they show you, and the film that they made that makes it all come alive as the volcano explodes and engulfs the old city. So there are three things I can think of that are important about Naples. One, our fleet is there. Two, Pompeii is there. And three, Sophia Loren was born there. And she's about as powerful as any volcano I can think of. And so you might want to go and think about going to visit Sophia by going through to see Pompeii and the ruins, as they have been very well reconstructed for this exhibit in San Francisco. And some of us have gone in with our van, and some have gone independently. We who go independently occasionally go with a friend of mine here who loves to stay and eat. For some reason, he has a resistance to our dining room. But the rest of us have to come back and dine here and think about the wonderful show we just saw. But we aren't going to talk about that fleet or Sophia or Naples. We're going to talk about Taiwan. And Taiwan, just as we talk now, is completely protected by an enormous American numbered fleet. And it's there because of some series of reasons. Taiwan is a very unusual island off the coast of China. It's big, it's productive, and it's a democracy. thanks in large measure to us, who have been his protector for a very long time. We'll go back for a few moments and try and capture what we had talked of before. There once was a magnificent Chinese leader. He wanted very basically to bring China into the modern age. He was trying to eclipse all the damage that had been done to China through the centuries, particularly things like the Boxer Rebellion, or like the famous insurrection that it caused when the Opium War was forced onto the Chinese. But moving to modern times, we have ourselves stationed offshore with this huge numbered fleet because we're separating the People's Republic of China, known to many people as Communist China, from Nationalist China, which is the home of many of the Chinese that you know here and were lucky to get here in the many changes that took place. So what I can tell you to begin with was that once upon a time, long before you were gone, there was an American by the name of Stilwell, and he was appointed by FDR to be in charge of something called the China-Burma-India Theater. And he moved himself as quickly as he could to Chongqing. That's a city up the Yangtze River beyond the Three Gorges. He was able to hold out there because the Three Gorges were not approachable. Who was going to approach? Well, no one had worked it out this way, but when the Japanese decided to modernize, they had a revolution. They threw out the shogun, the Tokugawa shogun, and put in the Meiji emperor. And while the Meiji emperor was there, he took to the samurai. The samurai are not what you think they are. They're not just fighters, warriors. They're also the scholar class. And so the Meiji sent groups of scholars to Europe, to France, Germany, and Britain, to discover what it was that the West had that Japan did not have. And they came back and they quickly modernized Japan. Unfortunately for the Japanese, they fell under a military dictatorship, having already left one, the Tokugawa shogunate. They now were under an army military command that led to the famous war that you fought, called World War II in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor and all that. But in the meantime, we had put someone in Chongqing. That somebody was Stilwell, General Stilwell. His papers are here in the Bay Area. They're collected at the Hoover Institution for War, Revolution, and Peace. And you can go and look at them. A woman went and looked at them. Her name was Barbara Stilwell. Stilwell's book, which is, Tuckman's book, which is Stilwell and the Chinese Experience, got much of it wrong. She assumed that, in fact, Stilwell and his group were the hard fighters, and that Chiang Kai-shek, the generalissimo, was the one who was the problem child. In fact, the problem child was hoping to be able to hold back his strength so that when the war was over, he could do battle with the one person he knew would be dangerous. And that was Mao Zedong. So we come to the famous China Times. It's before there's anything important about Taiwan. And we have to think about what we're going to do. In Shanghai, there was a family. 3 girls, 3 boys. There was a mother and there was a father. The father came from an island, not Taiwan, but another island way south in China. And he worked his way to Shanghai, and then he decided he wanted very much to see the United States. But he didn't know how to get there unless he just stowed away. So he stowed away on an American freighter. the freighter left Shanghai and went to sea, and 2 days later, the captain discovered this stowaway Chinese. So he couldn't turn back, so he made a decision. He said to the Chinese in perfect Chinese, I'm going to punish you. I'm going to turn you into a Baptist. Now you have to realize what that might mean. There were millions of Americans in the 19th century who thought that China was lost and it needed to be converted. And so huge numbers of groups, particularly of Southern Baptists and Southern Methodists, volunteered to come to China, and they had children while they were here. So many of the most famous people you know from those years, Henry Luce, who happened to own Time and Life magazine, was born in China and helped found a famous university in China, Beida. And so as these people came of age, they had a tremendous amount of influence on American policy towards China, which then did not include Taiwan. Taiwan had become part of Japan. In Japan's expansion, she moved out into the areas nearby, and quickly under its military leadership, the Japanese took away from China its famous province in the north. We call it Manchuria, so do they, but the Japanese called it Manchukuo. And years later, a very famous Italian film director, Bartolucci, made a film called The Last Emperor, because the Japanese had been very clever and they'd brought a false emperor to be the token while they ruled behind the throne. So all these were very problematic things going on. In the meantime, this young man was educated in Georgia and then sent home with a Bible concession to sell Bibles in Shanghai. And he also got to know some people in the Green Gang, which was actually a gangster outfit, which is very typical of Shanghai. We have a word in English, to be shanghaied, means to be taken against your will on board a ship and shipped off to some foreign and distant place. So you have this story unfolding, and let me see if I can get it straight for you. He who is the father comes back to Shanghai, marries, has 3 girls, 3 boys. They become the most famous people in China. They're known as the Sung dynasty, not in the case Sung in S-U-N-G, but Song in S-O-N-G. Sung S-U-N-G is a famous dynasty from 1,000 years ago. Now you have to realize I'm trying to compress 1,500 years here for you to be able to get a little feel for what is Taiwan today. So in the way of speeding it up, you have an incident in Shanghai. It's an incident that is observed by a famous Frenchman, and he writes a book about it. It's called The Condition Humaine, or The Human Condition, and it's André Malraux. And he observes the attempts of 2 of the subordinate leaders under Sun Yat-sen, the great man who wants to make a democracy out of China. You have instead a split, one Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, and the other is Mao Zedong. Mao loses his first struggle and flees north on what's called the Great March. They go far beyond the Great Wall so they can escape the forces of Chiang Kai-shek. And then you have to sit through this long period of Chinese history. Still no one has thought anything about Taiwan. It's a Japanese-held island. And then suddenly things speed up. We began to win the war, if you can believe that. There we are, on the cusp of being the winners at the end of World War II. And we take over Japan, and we send an American Caesar there, a very strange man named General Douglas MacArthur, our American Caesar in Japan. And he lasts a while until Truman fires him. Still, it does not involve Taiwan. Then what happens is that there is a collapse, and you find that the nationalist Chinese, the Kuomintang, are now going to have to flee the mainland, and the only place they know to go is to Taiwan. So finally we get to Taiwan, an island off the coast, an island that had been before this time known as Formosa, an island that the Portuguese had worked and then had gone on to Japan. But once the Portuguese left, surely you remember that story when you're in high school of the king called the Navigator, and how the Portuguese left their shores and went forward and discovered all kinds of things, Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, and set up colonies in India, where they kept a colony right to the very end of the British time in Goa, and actually kept a small little colony on the coast of China, even after the Red Chinese took over. That was the island of Macau. All right, we're finally getting to the point. We are involved with a decision to protect the nationalists, and that means protecting the island of Taiwan. Now, maybe you're old enough to remember that we had a president by the name of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and we had another man who wanted the job worse than he, and that was Richard Milhous Nixon. And the two of them gave a famous debate that everybody watched in the early 60s. It was a debate about the two smallest islands you can imagine. You have this big island off the coast, which is Taiwan, and then you have these two little islands that are right next to the mainland, and they're called Quemoy and Matsu. And the question was, what will we do to defend them? And everyone was yelling, well, we'll have to defend them right to the death, da, 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 da. It's a very stupid argument, but it was two presidential candidates making the argument. What did happen was that the Red Chinese were not interested in the least bit in taking over Matsu and Quemoy. It was just as good for them to have those islands there to be looked at as for us to have them to look from. So we're stuck now. We have this incredibly important island. We don't want the Red Chinese to get it. Stilwell has already made it clear that he thinks that Chiang Kai-shek is a peanut, and he will argue with him to the day he dies, but there's nothing to be done. So what I've got to tell you is this. Taiwan becomes a close and abiding ally of the United States of America. We cared greatly about it, and we'd had to deal with these people before, because when it became clear that at the end of World War II, at this time, Mao Zedong and the 8th Route Army would not run away, but were coming down to the coast, had taken Beijing already, and the nationalist capital of Nanking was under threat. And Nanking had already gone under a terrible, terrible plague, because we'd had the Nanking massacre, in which children were bayoneted. It was really the most awful thing you can imagine. And so the Chinese, suffering through all of this, now saw that the Kuomintang, that is Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists, are going to flee from Nanking, their capital, out to the island of Taiwan in safety. And when they've run away, there's almost 1 million of them, and they're armed, and they will be rearmed by us, and they get to the island of Taiwan. Now, Taiwan hasn't played a role in all of this, and they don't know what are these people doing coming here, and they were very much disliked, but there were 1 million of them, and they took over. So Taiwan becomes this bastion off the coast of China, and is very much supported by us. Now, this support comes in very strange ways. Let me give you a story. Once upon a time, when she was in Chongqing, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, one of the three daughters and three sons, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, has to see a doctor. She has cancer. She leaves Chongqing, high on the Yangtze River, above the Three Gorges, gets across the Himalaya Mountains into India, gets from India by airplane to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York, gets cured. She's operated on. It's a success. She's dismissed. Does she go home? Not Madame Chiang. She gets on a train from a famous station in New York and goes south to Washington, D.C. She gets off. She goes from the station to the White House. Uninvited, unexpected. She just shows up, rings the doorbell, and goes in. Eleanor is surprised to see her. Franklin's even more surprised. She stays. She moves into the White House. She comes to dinner that night. I don't remember what they're serving, but anyway, it's a meal. And suddenly Franklin, to make easy conversation over dinner, he says, Madam Chiang, I have a terrible problem in this country. My problem is these darn people called Republicans. They're always giving me a hard time. What would you do if you had to deal with these Republicans in your country? She put down her chopsticks. She took this long, elegant finger and cut off heads. That's what she would do. Take the Republicans out and cut off their heads. Suddenly, Eleanor and Franklin knew what it was to meet a real dragon lady. She was there in the White House. She stayed for a while, and then she got the train back to New York, got a plane back to Los Angeles, got a plane back to Hawaii, got a plane back to India, and got a plane over the Himalayas, the highest mountains in the world, and was back in Chongqing. And in fact, she made a mess of it because when she landed in Chongqing, the pilot realized, because there were several broken cases, and what were in those cases? Vital things, war effort things, like Chanel No. 5. She had brought back with her a ton of clothes and other items she had bought while she was in New York. And so now the pilot is so furious that he has risked his life for all this that he destroys it all, breaks open all the, too bad you weren't there. You could have had all the wonderful Chanel No. 5 you ever wanted. So it was that a touch of Chiang Kai-shek's wife got even to the people in the White House. When she finally realized, along with her husband, that they were going to be thrown out of China, that Mao Zedong had come alive again, he had taken Beijing, the capital of the nationalist government was down on the Yangtze at Nanking, where the massacre had taken place earlier, and so they put themselves together and fled to the island of Taiwan. So at last we've got Madame Chiang Kai-shek and Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek both on the island of Taiwan, and 1 million of the Kuomintang, because they didn't want to be left behind either. So they ran away to the island of Taiwan, and then we inherited it. It's our island. We have to protect it. We give them a numbered fleet, and we take up our positions. We argue all through the 60s about what the problem is, and finally we decide the problem is our problem, and we have to make do. Now, the end of this story is very good, because for some odd reason, the American presence on Taiwan is favorable to democracy. It's an odd thing that if you stay around Americans long enough, we're catching. We're catching in that we actually are democratic in our ideals. We talk about the good side and the bad side, the upside, the downside. We talk about it all the time. We're very political people. And this rubbed off. And so today, if you go to Taiwan, you will find a flourishing democracy. It has started as a military dictatorship run by the Kuomintang, that is Chiang Kai-shek. Now, it didn't come happy. It didn't come easily. What you had to do is think of, well, what are we going to do? Well, Madame Chiang Kai-shek had already made her visits. When she had been thrown off the mainland and had fled to Taiwan, she brought with her huge numbers of cases of crates. You didn't know what was in them. When she was ready, she left and went to Beijing before it fell and completely ripped off the famous collection of art that's in that museum and brought it down to Nanking, and from Nanking she had it shipped over to Taiwan. So when she got to Taiwan, she had the entire Forbidden City, all of his artwork was with her, not with them. And ever since then, she went about her business very carefully. She got a good architect. Taipei is a funny city. It's quite large, extensive in the north of the island, and there's a rising hill in the back. It's called Grass Mountain. And she built on Grass Mountain the most incredible Asian art museum, better than anything we've got in San Francisco, better than anything we've got in Los Angeles. It is the premier art capital of the ancient Chinese people. It's not just a few years. China has 5,000 years of recorded history, and much of it is encased in art. So if you want to see real Chinese art, you get a plane from San Francisco International, and you can fly to Taipei. There's one flight at least a week, and then you can luxuriate in the most incredible art museum in the world. And they are very hazy about loaning it because there's a problem. We have to go back a chapter too. When Richard Nixon, who had been a hater of things Chinese communists for years, became president, he flip-flopped. And he went on his famous visit with Henry Kissinger to China. He met with Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, all the leaders. He saw the damage that had been done at Tiananmen Square by the student rebels. He saw the failure of the Great Leap Forward. And we have a wonderful opera about that if you want to see it someday. It's John Adams' opera, Nixon in China. It was produced by the San Francisco Opera Company. They did a very good job of it. And it gives you an insight into what these people were like. The only people who didn't like that opera was Henry Kissinger, because he comes off as a terrible womanizer. But since Kissinger is not loved by anybody, by many people anyway, it didn't bother many people at the New York Opera when the Metropolitan also did this opera. So you have this incredible thing going on. Madame Chiang Kai-shek, still alive and well, setting up the largest Asian art museum in the world on Grass Mountain behind Taipei. And the idea that many people in the United States are very related to this whole incident because they are the children of thousands of American ministers who came to China to convert them. Someone who's sitting here in the room is an example of that. And Henry Luce is the best example. The other one, of course, is the famous Nobel Prize winner Pearl Buck, who was born in China. And not only was she born there, she wrote the great book about it, The Good Earth, which won her a Nobel Prize in Literature. So you have these incredibly important and influential Americans now living back in America who had once had a historic time in Chinese history. And they were very important in making opinions. For instance, in this state of California, while all of you think that it's a much progressive state, it isn't a progressive state at all. And we used to have two awful senators here, Senator Knight and Senator Nolan. And they would have absolutely nothing to do with anything to do with communist China. So to them, it was kiss of death to even mention it. And to not support Taiwan was absolutely dangerous for your political life in Washington, because they were the biggest Taiwan supporters there were, because this had become a Cold War major effort to finally divide the West from the East. Now, one of the things that happened was there's always troublemakers in our country. We just had one as President of the United States. And now we had, in the 50s, the junior senator from Wisconsin, Senator McCarthy. McCarthy, who had his close advisors, people like Roy Cohen, a perfect schmuck. And so now we have this real problem that Senator McCarthy will blackball everybody, and he does. He comes out and calls the State Department full of communists, and one of the most favorable communists that he could think of was General of the Armies George Catlett Marshall, the man Churchill had called the victor, the organizer of victory in Europe, was now being called a communist by Senator McCarthy. It was a terrible, terrible time. So terrible that Eisenhower had to go to war himself to put down these. He was a great admirer, Eisenhower was, who is now president, of the general known as Marshall. So in a rather famous book by a Princeton scholar called The Hidden Hand President, Eisenhower went to do business with McCarthy and to ruin him, which took around 6 years to do with all those other terrible people around. And in the meantime, Taiwan still was there. It was quite obviously going to be a satellite of the Americans in Asia. It was going to be an enormously important base, and it was going to become a very strong economic actor, because like all Chinese in the world, they are most commercial people. They are people who are not given to communism at all. You just remember that communism was an idea of Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German Jew. He was not an Asian communist. And Karl Marx saw that if there was going to be a revolution that was Marxist, it would take place either in Germany, France, or Britain, the industrialized West, not over in that little forlorn place known as the Tsar's Kingdom of Russia, and certainly not in China. And so all these things were running haywire. And the most important thing was, I wanted to tell you that we had at Berkeley at one time the greatest Asianist that this world has ever produced. His name is Chalmers Johnson. He and his wife, Sheila Johnson, were both Berkeley PhDs, and they were so good they were both hired. Sheila didn't want to teach, so she gave it up and went instead and became a correspondent for a Japanese newspaper, a daily newspaper. She wrote the column while living in Berkeley, and Chalmers wrote the books. The first great book was the book about China, that China had not, in fact, fallen in love with communism, that it was a sheer accident. What China had done had suffered an enormous famine, which was nothing new for the Chinese. But the Hunan famine of World War II, where the Japanese stole most of the rice coming out of China, causing this famine to take place, was the real reason that the peasantry went over to communism. And so it was that Chinese nationalism became a sensational book because it refuted the idea that Chinese peasants ran around the countryside talking Karl Marx. They didn't know who the hell Karl Marx was. If they had any influence in their life at all, was the influence of Confucian scholars and Buddhist thinkers. They were not communists. So Chow's first book, and then the second one, when he had to switch fields, was he went over and wrote a magnificent explanation of the Japanese economy. And that book, which gives us the Ministry of International Trade and the Ministry of Industry, I happen to know these people very well, so in many days I would spend weekends by their pool, and I'd hear this cat behind me, and one of the cats was named Moth, and the other cat was named Meaty. And Moth's name stood for the Ministry of Finance, and Meaty stood for the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, because the great book that Chow wrote about Japan explained how the Japanese economy worked, which didn't work anything like our economy at all. After he wrote these famous books and became extremely famous, he quit everywhere. He quit Berkeley because he couldn't stand us any longer. He went on to UC San Diego. He hated them, so he quit by resigning in the San Diego Union, which is a newspaper. When people open the newspaper, the first thing on the editorial column was, I quit UC San Diego because it's so terrible, and there was a whole long string of what was wrong. And then Chow decided to write what public intellectuals write. Public intellectuals write books like Blowback, which are not my favorite books, but he made a fortune writing these public intellectual tracts, and they remain today as people, both Sheila and Chalmers Johnson, two of my greatest friends, and they are now gone, which is denies us a solid explanation for what's going on in Asia. But Taiwan goes on and on and on. It has a fleet protecting it and has a very, very ingrown industrial system. It happens to believe, like Chalmers did, that you can also direct an economy. And so economy can be fed certain leadership and it can go in certain directions. One of the few Japanese miracles that didn't take place this way was Toyota, but all the rest did. They were all guided by the state to become state players in a fabulous economic giant known as the Japanese economy today. And Taiwan got some of that also. They got a huge investment, and the investment quickly turned around and made more money. If you don't know anything about the Chinese people, you should remember this. They are the quintessential merchants of Asia. They have the idea of what it is to be a merchant, what it is to make money, is in their blood. When you see them go abroad, there are all those overseas Chinese cities. Singapore is nothing without the Chinese. It is a Chinese city. All over Asia, in Manila, in Malaysia, these people, in fact, it was a terrible thing that occurred in Indonesia when there were riots there against the Chinese because they were so productive and owned so much of the economy of Indonesia that the riots were aimed at them. So what we have is a very lucrative money-making machine. The Chinese don't think there's anything wrong with making money. They're not ashamed of it, and they put it to very good productive uses. They themselves have just gone through a terrible thing of having to stage a Olympic game in a non-attending audience, trying to make sure that they can make it work. Many in Japan were opposed to the Olympics and didn't want them to be staged, but the government finally made a decision. And as you know, it's finally coming to an end this week, and we will see what the world turns If there's anything I want you to remember, though, from this lecture is that Jesse Owens won the 1936 Olympics in Berlin when everyone knew that an African American couldn't do this because they're subordinate, because that's what Hitler believed. And Hitler was wrong, and Jesse Owens was right. And now when you go to Berlin, if you don't do anything else, I want you to go to the stadium, which is still standing there, and go stand on the avenue that is marked Jesse Owens Strasse, because the Berliners remember, and it's been almost 100 years. Taiwan also has many other features to its credit. They make excellent movies in Taiwan. Some of you recently saw one that I suggested to our film committee that we show. It's Ang Lee's famous movie, Brokeback Mountain. And we watched it, and many of us liked it. It's a very controversial subject. It's two males who fall in love with each other. We're going to see another one soon, and that one is Ang Lee's famous Crouching Tiger. You all know it, I hope. If you don't know, you'll know it soon because you'll have to come and see it at the movies here. And he makes other movies. Now, Taiwan makes movies in the very following way. They don't have a large population, maybe 25 million. So they make them all in English for export. Since English, by the way, if you've not noticed, is the international language today. 200 years ago, it was French. Now it's English, mainly American English. They talk like people from Brooklyn. So it is that you have a film industry, just like you do on the continent itself. The People's Republic of China, better known as Communist China, is very touchy about movies, but they have a living giant amongst them. His name is Zhang Yimou, and some of the great films are Hang the Red Lantern. It's a perfect communist film. You have this rich landowner. He's able to keep 4 concubines along with his regular family. And with the 4 concubines, you hang a lantern, and that's the woman he's going to stay with tonight. Then you hang the lantern next door, and that's the woman he's going to stay with. And finally, after 4 nights, he takes a rest and doesn't go to anybody, and then he starts the routine again. One woman, one woman, one woman. It's a brilliant film, beautifully put together, and with a movie star. They even have communist movie stars. Her name is Gong Li. She's incredibly beautiful, and she is one of the favorites. In fact, she and Yang Yimou are lovers, or were for many, many, many years. So you have to look under the red curtain to see all the various things. We now know that Mao Zedong was a terrible lecher. He had a train. Unfortunately, his doctor defected from the train, and so the train was simply loaded down with, shall we say, women of loose morals. And that was his entertainment, going around the countryside in this dreadful train. We know a lot about him because we know we fought him twice. Mao Zedong fought us through his People's Liberation Army in Korea. Because when the North Koreans started to lose, the Communist Chinese came in. And we fought against them again in Vietnam. When their supplies were short and not coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, somebody added supplies to those. And we knew they were Chinese because they were Chinese missiles. 107 missiles that could be fired from your arm. So it's been a very long and complicated time for the Americans to try and readdress their self to this thing called Asia. They tried every way they knew, and then even then Taiwan blew up on them. Not only did Madame Chiang Kai-shek come to the White House She was alive and well on the island of Taiwan when her husband, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, died. Now there's a vacuum at the top, and it's not a democracy yet. What to do? Well, surprise, surprise. Turns out that when Chiang Kai-shek had run away from China, he'd gone to the Soviet Union, which was trying to sponsor these various Chinese nationalist movements because they were the great communist power. So they married Chiang Kai-shek to a Ukrainian woman, and they had a child. So now suddenly this child appears. He's adult now, and he becomes the head of the Taiwan government, which is not yet a democracy. And the first thing he does, he says to Madame Chiang Kai-shek, "You go away." So now here's Madame Chiang Kai-shek. She has fled up the Yangtze, down the Yangtze, out of Nanking to Taiwan, and she's now being thrown out. Where does she go? Well, she has an unusual history too. Turns out, remember there were 3 sisters, 3 brothers. TV Sung was a foreign minister and finance minister also for Chiang Kai-shek. And what he spent his time doing, moving gold bars out of the country for safekeeping. Where would you put stuff for safekeeping? Why not the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York? And if you have diplomatic immunity where no one can check your suitcase, you can take gold bar after gold bar after gold bar all the way to Manhattan and give it to who? David Rockefeller. You remember the Rockefellers? David was the president of Chase Manhattan Bank. So when the family had to run, Madame Kung, remember her, the oldest sister, she had married a pharmaceutical fortune in China, and they had taken that fortune to Manhattan. She had a beautiful estate out on Long Island. So Madame Chiang Kai-shek is now being invited off Taiwan by her sort of son-in-law, but he was married to this other Ukrainian woman who no one ever saw. And so she flees to Long Island. And she goes on living there. She very much prides herself on an art form that we don't have in the West. We don't have penmanship that becomes so incredibly elaborate that you think of it as art. But calligraphy, done with Chinese characters, for many people is a very beautiful art form, and Madame Chiang does that. And so, lo and behold, San Francisco, California, welcomes Madame Chiang Kai-shek back to show her artwork. And she comes out here to San Francisco. Many of us meet her. She's very pleasant, speaks perfect English with a Southern accent. Remember, she went to a Baptist school in Georgia to learn English. And so she is here. She does give us a display of her artwork, and then she returns to her sister's place in Long Island, which is now home for her for the rest of her life. It's a very strange family. 6 sons, 3 boys, 3 girls. One of them, Madame Sun Yat-sen, married the future of China. Even when the communists took over, Mao Zedong allowed to be the permanent vice president of China, because they all respected the name Sun Yat-sen, the man who began the long trail in the 20th century for the Chinese people. So you have this sort of coming together of the family again, and Madame Chiang Kai-shek living off in Long Island, Madame Kung living in her estate on Long Island, and the brothers all squirreled away in their little parts of the world. And Taiwan, in developing. I think somebody is running up a phone bill. You have TV Song with the job he did, and he had all the other people also. So I think we've already gone over our time. So, and I'm not going to ask for questions. It's just too convoluted. I'll see you next week if you think you can stand it again. Thank you very much.